Episode 223, the Expert Series with Dr. Kevin Becker, a sports psychologist. Welcome to the pursuit of the perfect race. I'm Coach Terry Wilson, and with each episode, I bring stories of athletes to you that share their experiences at races in order for you to learn how to have your perfect race. We will hear stories from athletes of all ages, abilities, and races of all distances. So regardless of where you fit in, there's something in it for you. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Now let the pursuit begin. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Pursuit of the Perfect Race. I'm continuing my expert series by discussing sports psychology with Dr. Kevin Becker. Dr. Becker gained his doctorate degree in sports psychology and motor behavior from the University of Tennessee and is a professor at Texas Women's University. Dr. Becker is also a certified strength and conditioning specialist and has been in sport himself for many years. Welcome to the show, Doctor. I look forward to... Let me try that again. Welcome to the show. I look forward to talking with you about an in-depth conversation. Gosh, I can't even read. I mess up quite a bit, so it is what it is.
Yeah.
Welcome to the show. I'm glad to have you on and look forward to an in-depth conversation. And gosh, I just can't read my sentence. Welcome to the show. I'm glad to have you on and look forward to an in-depth conversation about how our mind really plays a role in sport.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Terry. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So what made you want to get a degree in sports psychology?
Well, honestly, it came back to my own athletic experience. So my background is in track and field mainly, but not on the endurance side, on the strength and power side. So I was a thrower in track and field, the hammer throw specifically. And in college, I got really interested in the mental game because of my own failures, honestly. I'd had a couple really bad experiences as an athlete where I was disappointed in my performance, and it was something I just wanted to learn about. And so continuing on as an athlete, that's where my interest came. So beyond college, I continued to train, was training for the Olympic trials in the hammer throw, and started to study sports psychology. I got a master's degree in sports psychology, and then decided to continue on for my PhD. While I was getting my PhD, I was training for my last Olympic trials. This was the 2012 Olympic trials. And that year, I myself connected with a sports psychologist and worked really in depth with him for the course of a year. And that really just had a positive impact on me as an athlete and the way I was able to perform. And so from there on, I really just wanted to continue to spread knowledge and be able to help other people to do the same thing.
Wow. So before we get too into the weeds here, what is sports psychology?
So sports psychology in general, what we're thinking about is how your mind contributes to your sport performance. An important thing to point out is there are a couple different tracks or types of sports psychologists. So there are sports psychologists that are mental health professionals that we would call a clinical sports psychologist. And so these are people that are licensed professional psychologists. So they're trained and licensed to treat mental health disorders that also have some expertise in sport. The other type of a sports psychologist is more of a performance-based sports psychologist. So this person typically has an advanced degree in some type of sports science or in sports psychology, but they are not trained in as a mental health professional. And so seeing someone that's this type of a sports psychologist, sometimes called a performance consultant, sometimes an educational sports psychologist. I tend to call myself a mental performance coach. Those are people that are helping you with the performance aspect of how your mind contributes to your race, for example. And so in thinking about that, you just need to understand what it is that you're looking for and connect yourself with the right type of professional.
Okay. So for people that are wanting to actually get better in sports, the performance side would probably be better versus the people that deal, or the professionals that deal with the mental health disorders.
Yeah, so the main thing, there's no reason that a clinical sports psychologist can't help you with the performance issues. It comes down to what is the person's primary expertise. And so sometimes somebody on the performance side, if you're looking at trying to regulate motivation, regulate your anxiety in competition, develop performance plans, that fits more on the performance side. You might want to do some of those things, but you might also be struggling with something greater that comes outside of the sport. And somebody with a performance background is not trained, not licensed, not qualified to help you with those things. So we see some athletes that might struggle with disordered eating, an eating disorder. And on that side of things, clearly a sports psychologist with performance training is not the person to help you.
Okay. So with sports psychology in general, why is it important for athletes to have mental toughness in the power side and the endurance side of things?
Well, I think in general, when you look at your performance, we all train. If we're training seriously for a sport, we put a ton of hours into the physical training for our performance. So think about all the miles that you're logging. You're preparing yourself physically, and that's clearly really important. If you're not prepared physically, you have very little chance to have a great performance in endurance sport. But when we look at the mental side of things, you can be completely trained physically. You can be prepared to have the greatest race of your life. And if you've not prepared well mentally, your mind can keep you from achieving your goals. And so when we look at mental toughness, when we look at mental training skills, it's a spot where you don't want to leave yourself vulnerable. If you've not trained the mental game at all, even if you're in great physical fitness, you're going to have a hard time having your best race that you could have. And so if you've spent some time on the mental game, whether it's simple or complex, if you have a strong mental plan going in, you have a lot better chance of doing what your body can allow you to do.
Okay, so along that same path there, how do you build more mental toughness? I mean, I've talked with over 200 people about the endurance avenue of this. I mean, some of these people have a lot more mental toughness than others, where others don't really have the power to push, where some do. How do you build that?
So it's one of those things that depends a little bit person to person. So every person inherently is going to be a little bit different. Some people we see come into the sport and people might just say that person's just so mentally tough and we don't really understand why. Other people, they might come in and they don't feel that way right away. And so what we want to point out with any of this stuff is these are all skills. If we're not good at something, if we practice it, we get better. And so when we're looking at developing mental toughness, it's what can I do to get myself there? And so usually we're starting to look at building some mental training skills into training. Mental toughness isn't something that just happens on race day, especially in training in endurance sports. If you're training for an Ironman, I mean, the training is grueling. And so every day is an opportunity to practice your mental toughness, whether that come down to skills like the self-talk you're using, your anxiety or arousal regulation, looking at setting the right types of goals to allow yourself to continually achieve positive small experiences. If you build those things together right, you're developing your mental toughness along with your physical training.
Okay. So just by what you said, it really reminds me of when I talked to Ellie Salthouse. She's a professional triathlete. And when we were talking, she has this overwhelming, happy, bubbly personality. I love her personality to death. I mean, you wouldn't think that she has what it takes to win an Ironman just by talking with her in person, or if you ran her on the street, you'd be like, oh, wow, she's a funny girl. But she has what it takes to dig deep and push hard and go faster than everybody else when it comes time to do this. And it really is really unique. Whenever I asked her what her definition of a perfect race is, she said one where she doesn't go into a negative headspace. Yeah. And that was like, wow, like, well, I wonder why she says that. And does everybody want to stay away from the negative headspace, or is sometimes that good? What is that?
Well, when you think about something like a negative headspace, it's, I've talked to a number of athletes over the year that will tell me that they kind of beat themselves up in their mind, and that can be motivating when they're almost talking down to themselves in a voice, and then that motivates them to come back stronger. And so, if an athlete's doing that and it's working well for them, I would never tell them not to do that. But when we think about a negative headspace, that in most cases, that can really hurt you. So if I'm looking at the amount of time I'm investing or the amount of time a race takes, getting into a negative space where if I'm doubting myself, if I have some self-doubt throughout my race, it's going to make it really difficult to persist and stay focused on what I want to do to achieve. And so when we look at avoiding a negative headspace, if we can get through an entire race without being in that space, without doubting if I'm good enough, or without doubting if I've trained well enough, without worrying about, look at all these people that are passing me. This is going to turn out horribly. I'm looking at my pace and I'm not on the pace I think I should be on. We can really kind of implode if we let ourselves fall into that. So, I think getting into a race where you don't have any time in that negative headspace is really difficult. What I think becomes more important is training yourself how to get back out, recognize it, and get out of it when you are there. You're always going to have those experiences. I remember early on when I was mental training as an athlete, I was thinking about how cool is it going to be when I can show up at an Olympic trials and not have any worries or negative thoughts because I'm so mentally strong. And my last Olympic trials, it was very clear that doesn't happen. It was a really good learning experience for me as a sports psychologist, actually, because you're not going to ever get away from that stuff. You're going to show up to whatever is your big competition, and you're going to have some jitters. You're going to get into a tough spot in a race, and you're going to doubt yourself. So the more important thing is, what's your plan to get out of that space? And that's what I tend to work more with athletes on, is recognizing a bad space and figuring out how to get out of it quickly before it spirals out of control.
Right. So that reminds me of a guy I interviewed for Ironman Texas last year. His name is Joe Adrians, and he was actually one of the first ones to mention he would have a negative thought, and then he would put that negative thought in his hand and hold it and look at it and go, I'm having a bad thought. Why am I having this bad thought? And then he would go, okay, I need to eat. So then he would start feeling better, which would get rid of that negative thought, and then he'd be able to go harder. And he was just able to control it, go, oh, that's a bad thought, and then just get rid of it and get better thoughts. Is that a skill that you can develop over time?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, I like that. I like that analogy of putting it in your hand, because you're taking it out of your head. Other things I've talked about with athletes before is, thinking about and taking it, put it up on a shelf, and you can come back to that later. But that tends to work more when you're in a dynamic sport like basketball or something. You take a horrible shot, and then you need to get back on defense immediately. So the idea is to put it on the shelf and come back to it later. But, in this type of a sport, I like that analogy of reflecting on why is it there and how can I overcome it? And then ultimately, if it is I'm hungry, it's a feeling issue, that's a way to redirect. So whatever your plan is, you're recognizing it, you're taking it out of your mind, and then you're redirecting to something else. And so, that's a good plan. Other thought-based ways that I've had athletes redirect is, we'll go into a competition with a list of redirecting thoughts of, I recognize in my races, these are thoughts that come up sometimes that can hurt me. So what's my plan for when that happens? So if I get into that negative headspace in the middle of my race, here are 3 or 4 options of how I can get out of it. And if I go into the race having thought about that and prepared for it, now I've got a chance. Now I've got some ammunition to fight with, where if I'm just getting into the race without a plan, I have to react and try to figure it out. I might still be able to do that, but I've made it a little bit harder on myself.
Right. So usually in the marathon or in the later stages of the bike ride, normally around miles 70, 80, or 90 in the bike ride, or usually after the halfway point of the marathon, miles 14, 15 through 18, there's usually these defining points of time that I've seen where you're over halfway done with the entire race, but yet you still have hours to go, and usually there's no way around. It might be dark outside, and you really have to understand your defining purpose of being out there in the first place, or an overwhelming sense of gratitude to even do the sport. I guess the question is, how would you define tactics to battle these demons? Because that's what it sounds like you were talking about.
Well, it's probably another one of those things that comes down a little bit to what are your specific demons. But I think one thing you hit on a little bit there is knowing what your purpose is. Why are you doing this? If I know really strongly why I'm doing this, and this is something I'm passionate about, and this is something I love, that's something that can make it a little bit easier to get through those dark times. If I'm only sort of doing this, if I'm calling myself a triathlete, if maybe I used to be a lot more into this, but now I'm not really sure why I'm still doing this, then those times are going to be a lot harder. And so it comes back to what's your purpose to fall back on. If I'm somebody that, if I've identified my purpose and this is something that I love and this is my favorite thing to do in the world, and I live for the feeling of what it's like to cross the finish line at the end of an Ironman, maybe not what it feels like then, but more the emotional experience of it, then that's something that can give me a drive to continue. If that's not me, I need a different plan. So when I'm looking at trying to figure out how to fight those demons, I need something that's more powerful than the demons. So sometimes for some athletes, it might be reflecting on a previous feeling of passion that I've had during this sport, or reminding myself why I do like to do this sport. And if I can generate an emotional response with the thought, then that can become more powerful with the demons. So that's probably the general direction I would push someone in, is trying to figure out, attach yourself to something with a positive emotion. So it's not just a thought, it's a thought that leads to an emotion, because then that positive emotion can carry you through really the dark feeling of that demon is bringing to you.
Wow. So thoughts that lead to emotion is key.
Yeah, I would say so, because it's you're trying to create a response in your body. And so cognitive behavioral theorists would say that thoughts influence your emotions and emotions influence the response in your body. And so if I'm trying to get myself through this experience, if I can identify a thought that's tied to a positive emotion, that should go a lot longer than if I'm just telling myself one foot in front of the other. If I can tie myself to that emotion, then that emotion can be something to carry me through the pain and the challenge of this exhausting event.
So the self-talk is more important than a mantra. Is that what you're saying? Or is having a mantra really that important?
I think either one works. If you think about a good mantra oftentimes brings with it a feeling of strong emotion. And so, I mean, I as an athlete used mantras all the time, and I really liked that. But I don't think everyone needs to have a mantra. I think you need to figure out what works for you in those moments. And that's something that comes through practice, trial and error, and figuring out how that goes. And that doesn't need to occur again just on race day. If we think about clearly, if you're training for an Ironman, you're having some really difficult training sessions as well. And those sessions are the time where you need to be practicing these mental skills along with that training, so that when you feel this way, or maybe even feel that way even worse in the race, then you've got some experience to fall back on of how to handle it.
All right. So in Ironman, you know that you can't use music during the race. You can't have your phone on you. You can't text. You can't really listen to anything on your phone. You can't have anything with you besides what's out there on the course. So in training, should you listen to music or watch TV? Or would that be kind of like bait and switch, where you have this during training, but then on race day, it's a lot harder because you're not able to kind of separate yourself from what you're doing? Is that good or bad?
I would say it would be important to not always have music or TV or something in your training. If I'm always accustomed to having that when I'm cycling or running, then that's going to be probably hard to cope with in a competition. But at the same time, I mean, training can be very long and monotonous. And so if we can get a positive performance benefit by listening to music and training, and that helps us to work closer to our performance goal at the end, I wouldn't say that we shouldn't ever use it, but you probably should also have some time where you're out there relying just on your mind, where your mind is what's carrying you through instead of using something external like that. So I would say, like I said, I don't think it's important to never use music or something like that. But I would be careful not to become reliant on it. So you're using it. Yeah, exactly. So you wouldn't ever want to rely on something that you can't have in your race. So it's, in the throwing events, in my background in training, a lot of people now are using an iPad. A lot of people now are using an iPad to record every single attempt they take. And then they're going and they're watching slow motion video of their attempt afterward. We can't do that in a competition. So it's a similar thing. You don't want to become reliant on something that you can't have on competition, but at the same time, you don't want to not use it if it's something that can help you. So it becomes a balancing act, I think.
Right. So to kind of talk more about all the fun stuff with the judgments and whatnot, how can athletes not pass judgment on themselves in training or even in racing?
That honestly can be a really tough thing to figure out. And it's, we are going to self-evaluate. We're going to have sometimes positive and sometimes negative judgments of ourselves. And so I think the most important thing that we need to figure out is how do we put those in context? So sometimes I need to have self-evaluations. I need to figure out, what have I done well? What have I not done well? And sometimes even, where am I right now? If I'm in training leading up to what's supposed to be my big race of the year, and looking at the things I'm doing in training, they're not quite matching up with where I thought I was going to be. I need to be honest with myself and maybe reevaluate, what does my race need to look at? What does my fitness look like right now? If I don't, probably the worst thing I can do is not have the fitness that I think I'm supposed to have, quote unquote, and go into the race and pretend that I do. If I'm doing that, I'm probably setting myself up for failure with my race plan. So in that particular instance, maybe I need to evaluate and reevaluate what my overall goals are of where I think I can compete right now. Other types of judgments we'd maybe look at, I would encourage an athlete, if I was working one-on-one with them, I'd encourage them to look at, what are these judgments? What are they about? Are they about where you think you should be? Is it a judgment of you compared to someone else? And we would probably dig into a little bit, is this a meaningful judgment, or is this something that's really just hurting you? If I'm judging myself compared to what other people are doing, I have no control over what other people are doing. We could get into a race and I could have the best race of my life. And if that person is running faster than me, there's nothing I can do about that. They might also have the best race of their life, but that doesn't mean that I shouldn't stay focused on achieving what I'm trying to achieve.
Right. And, I've had some of the higher level age group athletes say that comparison is a thief of all joy. And it really seems like that is just a way for them to focus on themselves and do the very best that they can do without looking everywhere else for their answers.
Yeah. I think the challenge with that is a race is about competing with other people. It's not just
it is a comparison.
It's not a time trial just to see who can get a personal best. The structure of a race, the prize money is not given out for personal best. It's given out for winning or placing in a top place. So we don't want to lose sight of competition. In my years of working with track and field athletes across different events, field and track events, the one thing I feel like we lose sometimes in track and field, and you can tell me if you feel like this is true in triathlon as well, we lose sight of how to compete. We get so focused on just going out and having personal bests that when it comes to a major championship, sometimes people have forgotten how to actually compete. So we don't want to lose sight of that. We want to recognize that the goal of this, if you're entering a race, your goal is to often see how high you can place compared to other people. And so there's a place for that competition with others. To me, that comes from a motivation standpoint. And then there also needs to be the separate part of staying within yourself, staying within your race plan. So if I have, I've been working with my coach for months and we think that I'm on pace to finish with this time, or we think whatever it is, we think this is what I'm capable of right now. We're probably developing a race plan that can get me to that. So looking at different paces, these are kind of sub goals of the overall race. I need to be able to stick with that. My race plan is probably never just to go in and try to just stick with that person over there the whole time. So the other people can be motivation. To me, if we're focused just on, this is my race plan, this is what I need to achieve, but I'm surrounded by these other people that are very competitive with me, just being surrounded in those people can give you a little bit more. It can give you a little extra motivation, can give you some additional drive. But if I get wrapped up in worrying about what they're doing as opposed to still executing my race plan, then it can get kind of tricky. I can get off course, and especially in endurance or ultra endurance events, a small error here can lead to a big failure there. If I'm going out too hard initially, it's going to be really hard to come back and recover from that later. So I would say the two need to go together. I can be motivated by my competition, but I need to still stay focused on what I need to do to succeed.
All right. So with the failure that you mentioned, a lot of athletes, I feel like, don't really go all in. Like some athletes, maybe 10 people that I've interviewed, really know how to go all in and not really have a fear of failure. How can normal athletes get to that point where they release that fear of failure and DNFing, which is do not finishing for those listening, and actually go all in? How can people get to that point?
It's something that is difficult. That's one of the more difficult things we need to do in sports. So it's fear of failure is present in every facet of our life. I mean, if you think about relationships, if you think about work, career, fear of failure is something that we all struggle with in a lot of areas of life. And so if I want to reduce my fear of failure and feel like I can go into an experience more confident and willing to put myself out there, what that comes back to is that comes down to confidence in that skill. So self-efficacy is a term we use for situation-specific self-confidence. So if I want to be able to go into a race without fear of failure, I need to be able to feel confident in my ability to succeed in that race. The way that we do that is we need to have more positive experiences than negative experiences. So the number one predictor of how confident somebody feels is what have they done previously, their previous accomplishments. And so when I look at that in terms of a race, clearly other races I've competed in before are going to influence that, but I can also build in positive experiences in training. So if I want to be able to race without a fear of failure, number one, I need to probably define what is failure. So if it's a DNF, I need to be able to be confident that I have a plan that keeps me from DNFing. And so I have the confidence in that plan. And then I need to build positive experiences that act as evidence in my mind that I can do that. So if we look at some of the more grueling training sessions I have, if I got through that training session without DNFing, that's one small deposit in the bank of confidence. If I do that again in a different training session, that's another positive deposit in the bank. And so we need to find ways to build up as many positive experiences as we can to counteract maybe any negative experiences that we've had.
Okay. So as a coach, that's one of the things I love asking athletes when they say, hey, I want to do this race over here down in Galveston, for instance. It's a 70.3 distance race, which is a half iron. And I say, okay, cool. What's your goal for that race? They say, all right, I want this time. Okay. And I ask the very next question is, what workouts do we need to do in training to give you the most confidence on race day? And the way I phrase that is, I want you to get to the dock, get ready to jump in the water and go, I'm ready to beast this race. I'm going to absolutely crush this race. I'm not just prepared. I'm not just ready, but I'm ready to dominate this race. That's the confidence level I want you to have. How do we get there? What workouts do we need to do at what paces, what speed, what power, whatever it might be for that athlete? What do we need to do to get you there? And then we backfill that. So that is a good way to do that?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the most important part of that is helping the athlete to understand that those things they do in training, those are pieces of evidence. Those are deposits that we can put into our confidence bank that tell us that we can do that. I've worked with some athletes that they really struggle with the confidence aspect. They fear they're not going to be able to succeed in their sport. And it's because they're not recognizing all the great things that they're doing. So they might not understand that. So if I think about it, so if I'm preparing for that race, I'm not just going out and practicing that race. Clearly, I'm not going to go out and practice that entire race. It's impossible. But for some athletes, they may not understand that the fact that I'm succeeding in all these smaller puzzle pieces that build up to the preparation for that race, they have to know that those are things that are preparing them, that are giving them the confidence that they need to be able to do it. So it's when I finish that workout, it's looking at and seeing that I successfully completed this. I pushed myself farther today than I thought I could yesterday. And I need to know that. And so some type of reflection afterward, whether it's the athlete on their own or the athlete and the coach conversing, it's important that they understand that this is a piece of the puzzle. The fact that I did this has made me more prepared to go on and be successful in that race. And so when they recognize all those things building up, now their confidence is built up on their own. They don't have to talk themselves into it anymore. They've continually succeeded. All these small successes have now added up to preparation for a big success.
Well, that goes into a good question of how can athletes not really reflect on every single workout as a pass or fail opportunity and more see that, hey, it's just consistent work over time that is going to lead to your overall success?
That's a good question. So when we look at each individual workout, I mean, clearly our body is not a machine. There are fluctuations that happen in our body where some days I'm going to feel outstanding and some days I'm not going to feel outstanding. Some days I'm going to feel downright terrible. And so, we don't want to get too far into that. We want to recognize, are we on track? If we're consistently feeling terrible in our workouts, we need to figure out what's going on to cause that. But, we need to be okay with the ebbs and flows of how we feel in training. So every individual workout, if I had one bad workout, it's maybe, if I backtrack a little bit, it's maybe kind of going back and figuring out what should the outcome of this workout be with the body of work that I'm doing right now. When I finish this workout, should I feel outstanding? Or are we in a block of training right now where by design, we are overloading and this is not going to feel good? So I think probably the most important thing is the perception of how does the training all fit together and what should I be feeling like right now? And that's probably best handled by good open communication between coach and athlete, with the athlete openly expressing how did they feel after that workout, and the coach kind of looking at that and understanding where do I think the athlete should be with how I designed the training, and in figuring out, making sure that they're both on the same page as far as what should be happening right now. How's the person's body responding? And is that what we're expecting, or do we potentially need to modify the plan, or where do we go from here?
Wow. So in regards to actually self-judgment and self-assessing, do you feel like athletes have the ability to take themselves too seriously?
100%. It's, you can really ruin yourself worrying about, are you in the right type of fitness? I can remember, once I graduated from college, I was self-coached as a track and field thrower for about 7 years. And, thinking about it, it's probably one of the best things and one of the worst things I've ever done. If I had gotten in contact with a really highly qualified coach following college, I probably could have progressed a lot more. Having fought through a lot of those struggles of trying to self-coach for that many years also taught me a lot. So the one thing I can remember is I spent hours and hours and hours developing spreadsheets, periodization plans of how I thought my training should go. And then I wrote the training. And then when I was doing the training, I was constantly worried about, did I plan this well enough? Is my body going to peak at the right time? And the fact that I was so worried about that actually kind of sabotaged the training. And so at some point I got to the point where I just started writing about the most basic training programs you could write. And I fully committed to just trusting them. And my results really improved a lot because I was no longer so anxious about how things were going out. So when we look at self-evaluations, when we look at self-reflecting on each individual workout, I'd say the important thing is keeping it in perspective, looking for big signs of where should I be, how am I be, but also kind of reflecting on what else was going on in my life. And so how was my sleep? How has my nutrition been? How is my stress going? Stress, a lot of people are training for triathlons. A few people are lucky that that's their full-time job and they're not doing anything else. But if I also have a job or a family, there's a lot of stress outside of my sport that goes into that. And that factors into how my body responds to training. So I think, to kind of bring it back full circle, the most important thing is I think it's good to self-monitor, but we don't want to self-monitor to the point where it's controlling you or it's causing anxiety.
Wow. So you mentioned family and whatnot. So, I mean, this is like an issue with, it seems like every single person I've interviewed. It's the life, work, training balance. It's so hard to balance all that effectively. And even with some of the higher end athletes that I've talked with, they always seem to have true, honest, open communication. But then you have the idea of, well, I'm not able to spend time with my family that I want, and then that's creating this pressure on themselves with not spending time with their family, or they're not able to fully commit because their mind is somewhere else, and that's a stress there. Do you understand that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really one of the most challenging things we can look at, especially in a sport that requires so much time for training. And I think at my peak of training, I was training probably 15 to 20 hours a week for my sport, and that was taxing. It was difficult for me to give up time with family, with friends. I'd skip out on a lot of weekend trips with friends because I needed to get those training sessions in, or I knew I needed the time to recover so I could, get back into training for the next week. And so finding balance in life, I think, is one of the most difficult things we can do. I think the most important thing is to be honest with yourself and look at your life and say, what do I really have time for? And what is the most important to me? If you're looking at trying to be the best triathlete you can be, you might be tempted to look at, well, how are the top 10 triathletes in the world training? Without recognizing that maybe those people, that surely some of them have families, but if they have the right sponsorships, they are not out there working a full-time job too. So if you are working a full-time job and you're trying to train like them, you're not going to get the same results there. You're going to be exhausted. You're going to be burnt out, and you're not going to continue to progress the way that you want to do. And so, in some ways like that, I think you need to be a little bit more thoughtful about how can I train successfully? So maybe I can't handle the same training volume that those people can handle because I have these other things in my life. Priority wise, if my family is really important to me, and if I'm out on the road and throughout the whole workout, all I'm thinking about is how I'm missing doing this or that with my son or my daughter or with my spouse, then that's going to influence your training. So if the whole time you're training, you're thinking about what you're missing somewhere else, it's not going to be a quality training session. And so I think you need to figure out individually, what is your balance? What are your priorities? And if it's important to me that on Saturday mornings, I need to be able to be at this with my family, then I need to figure out, okay, how can we build a training program that fits around that? And I think if you can honestly assess, where am I at? What do I have time for? And what's most important to me? Even if maybe your training plan of the training that you're doing isn't what a coach would call the ideal training plan, if you're happy while you're doing that, if you're happy with the balance you have with the rest of your life, you're probably going to have better results than if you're doing the ideal training plan and you're miserable in other areas of your life.
Wow. So with all of this support here with the family and whatnot, I've seen athletes that have spouses that have true dedicated support. And then I've had athletes come on that have spouses that really just have fake support, where, hey, are you going to come to bed? When are we going to get a date night again? Versus, hey, you need to make sure you're nailing your nutrition. I'm going to help with the laundry. I'm going to help make the bed. I'm going to take all these things off your plate, and you better get out of bed tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock to go get your swim in. And like, that's real support versus the fake support. Do you feel like this could actually lead to failure if they have fake support because there's really like an underlying stress there?
Yeah, I think that absolutely is going to create a problem, because that's going to create tension in an important area of your life. And so when you think about the support of a spouse or of a family, I think it's really important that that person really understand, what is this lifestyle truly like? And so, and not just on a surface level, they need to understand, this is what my life is going to look like. And this comes down to, a really strong communication between you and that person. This is what my life needs to look like for me to reach my goals. These goals are important to me. This is what I want to do with my life. Does this work for you? And then that person needs to make an honest assessment of, can I handle that? Is this the life that I want? And if there's a mismatch there, there's going to be conflict. And anywhere, if you have spousal conflict, I mean, again, that's a major stressor in life that is going to have an influence on your training, and even beyond the training. More importantly, it could have a negative influence on your relationship, your life overall. And so I think that's kind of step one, is does your support network, do they really understand what this lifestyle is like, and can they handle that? And then if the answer is yes, I think there's still always a continual discussion of, is this still working for us? And so if you get to the point where you've had that conversation, or maybe you're in the situation where you're already living that and you don't feel the full support, you need to figure out what's more important to you. If is triathlon so important that you feel like you need to make a change in your relationship, in your life? Or is it that you really come to the conclusion that your outside life, your relationship with your spouse or family is more important to you than triathlon, and you need to reprioritize how can you make your training work? And so it comes back to that conversation. Maybe these are things that I can't do. I need to readjust my goals or readjust my expectations and say, I'm willing to commit this amount. This is the amount of time that I can commit. But during that time, I'm going to fully commit. So I'm not going to log as many hours in training. I'm not going to be as disciplined with my nutrition, but in the amount that I am dedicated, I'm going to fully commit. A fully committed person training 15 hours a week might get better results than a partially committed person training 25 hours a week.
Wow. So with this, how can athletes prepare their spouses and family for the commitment of training? Because, I was talking with my brother, and you're going to laugh at this, and I know I got to laugh at it, but he's like, why is training so hard for people, and why do you even need a coach? And I was like, okay, well, why is this the conversation was, why is this an issue? And I said, okay, well, what I want you to do is, being that you have a family, he has a son and a daughter and a wife. And I said, okay, for 25 hours next week, I want you to put your phone off and go into the bedroom, and none of your family can talk to you for 25 hours among all of the other time that you're supposed to be with them. And he was like, why? Well, that replicates the training that athletes are doing. And that's why it causes a wedge for a lot of people, because it's like a part-time job that you're not getting paid for, and it's a wedge.
Yeah. I think that, in helping someone to fully understand, what's going to be the easiest is that person has lived that life. Or if we're talking about a spouse, if your spouse has trained for the triathlon themselves, they're going to have a deeper understanding. If they don't have that, then again, there needs to be a really strong communication of, this is what my training calendar has to look like. If we're 4 months out from a race, if this is when this race is, between now and then, this is what I need to do on each and every day. When I'm not doing those things, I'm fully committed to being here with you and our family, and I want to do those things. But when I am doing those things, I need to be fully committed to my training. And so that piece alone might be kind of an important one, because there's probably a lot of athletes that are fully committed during their training hours, that I'm 100% doing this. I'm not going to be distracted, and then this is it. But then if you're in that situation where you have the family, you probably also, when you leave training, you need to probably try to leave it there. So when you are spending the hours with your family, you need to have some time where you're not still thinking about training, where you're not texting with your coach or texting with training partners. And so they understand that you're fully committed to training when you're there, but then you do them the favor of, you are fully committed to them when you're not training. I think that might be a slightly overlooked area. But aside from that it just needs to be, your spouse or whoever it is needs to understand completely what the demands of the sport are, and really probably live it for a while to see what it's like and learn how to live that type of lifestyle. Because if this is something new that you haven't done before, where you all have had this other life before, and now 25 hours of that life have been taken away a week completely, it's going to be an adjustment period where they need to figure out, how does our life work now? And then within your relationship, continually reassess, is this working for us? Is there something that we can change? Do we need to do something different?
Wow. So it's really just comes down to really having a conversation with your spouse, going, hey, this is important to me. Here's how I'm going to address it. This is what the future looks like. And these are a list of things that I need you to do to better support me. And on that list would include no negative comments, because I feel like, as an athlete myself, one negative comment I'm going to replay that over and over in my mind going, okay, that's going to create a mountain of stress in the long run because of that one little comment that I keep thinking about of, wow, she doesn't really support me or whatever,
Yeah, I would recognize that, but I would also challenge that and say that's, if you think about, when we tell ourselves, can you go through your entire race without having a negative comment? The answer is probably no.
True.
And so part of that would become, allowing your spouse a space to express what's going on with them. But then being able to have a conversation about it, being able to move forward with it. And then as the athlete, if you've encountered that negative thought, you need to have the mental training, you need to have the mental skills to be able to manage that negative thought, just the way you manage your own negative thoughts throughout your race. So it's probably a little bit of both, where clearly you don't want malicious negative thoughts. You want this person, ideally, hopefully this person wants this goal for you almost as bad as you want it for yourself. But recognizing that this is going to create a stressor on them, you need to maybe figure out how can I best support them, because this is difficult for them too, and then figure out how do we move forward together where we're working really as a team still.
Wow. So to transition a little bit to another topic here, because we have a little bit of variety with all of these different questions I've gotten.
Yeah.
Is there like a way that we could really tell people to separate the real pressure from imaginary pressure in race scenarios?
Yeah. So pressure is a really interesting thing, because pressure can come from an external source or an internal source. So external pressures, I could have pressure from a coach. I could have pressure from a spouse. It could be, that same thing we were kind of just talking about. It could be, you've been investing your entire life in this for a long period of time. When is this going to take off? When are you going to have this? And so they might have an external pressure toward you. Coach might have an external pressure of what's going on. Why are you missing workouts, or why aren't you hitting the times that were projecting that you should hit? And so you might feel some pressures from outside like that. But honestly, most people, a lot of the pressure that they experience is pressure they've put on themselves. Really? One of the most important, I would think so. You can correct me if you think I'm wrong on that. But I think, a lot of the pressure that we experience, sometimes it's a perception of what we think somebody else is thinking. So if I might put pressure on myself because I have my own certain goals and I really want to get there. And if I'm not progressing the way I want to, that can be a lot of individual pressure of, I need to do more, I need to try harder, I need to change something. And so that can be a pressure on myself. But, I've worked in the past with different team sport athletes, and some of those athletes, they perceive this certain pressure from the coach. And in having a discussion with the coach, it turns out that wasn't really what was going on. Same thing in this environment, you as the athlete could have the experience where I really feel like I'm under a lot of pressure because coach really wants me to qualify for this certain event, or coach really wants me to hit this certain time. And maybe the coach has expressed that, or maybe they've just inferred that, but they've built that up a little bit more in their mind. So I would say the pressures that come from within, you need to figure out, one, are they real, or is this something I've created in my mind? And two, are they important, and how do I handle them? So I'm not sure if I've sidetracked too far to go.
That's fine, because that brings up the question, should coaches ask directly, hey, are you feeling any pressures or expectations that I haven't really established for you? Are you feeling anything like that? Or are you feeling like I have higher expectations than what you think you're capable of, or a certain question, like just to address the elephant in the room?
I think that can be helpful, but I think that can also be difficult for the athlete at times to express that to the coach. When we look at the coach-athlete relationship, ideally we have a very open and trusting relationship. But even when that's the case, there's power dynamic at play. So the coach, to some extent, is in a power role to the athlete, and so it can be, if I am feeling like the example you gave, if I feel like you as the coach are putting more pressure on me or being harder on me than other athletes, if I feel like that could still be a really difficult thing for me to say to you. So ideally, sometimes those conversations are somebody that's outside of the coach-athlete relationship. And, as a sports psychologist, that tends to be a place where they can fit in really well. So it can be a lot easier for an athlete to talk to somebody outside the situation about it, maybe at least initially, and then figure out what's the easiest or the best way to address this with the coach. Is that, every coach is different, every athlete is different, and even if a coach appears very open to criticism, very accepting of the athlete, some athletes still might feel really uncomfortable telling the coach something like that. And so an uninvolved third party can sometimes be an easier place to start with that.
Wow. So to add something completely new, I guess it'd be kind of new, but I've dealt with a lot of athletes on the podcast. Many are pros, and some of them are even rookie professionals where they're just getting into the pro field. And some of them have this imposter syndrome of not belonging, and they're just not right. And this creates another anxiety on race day, which could be self-sabotaging. What are some tips for them to get past that?
That's honestly a really hard one, especially when if somebody's a new professional. A lot of times what happens is, you've spent a lot of time probably climbing the ranks to get to be a professional. And during that time, you've looked at these people who are professionals. You've looked up to them, maybe even almost idolized them. And they're this like mystical person to you that you can't believe that you're training with, or you can't believe that you're racing with them now. And so that can be a hard hurdle to get over. And so in those situations, especially, I think going into that type of a race, an athlete needs to have a real realistic expectation of what do I plan to do in this race. So if this is my first race as a professional, it's probably very unlikely that I'm going to go out and win this race. That clearly every now and then something like that happens, but I need to go into that race saying, this is my first race as a professional. What do I want? What do I expect to achieve here? And so I'd say that would be step one in going into a race like that, is what's the realistic goal here? So I want to challenge myself. I want to push myself. But what do I expect to do? So if I'm looking down the line at these people that I've really looked up to, or that I perceive as, wow, they're so good, do I even belong in this group? If I can come back to what I'm planning to achieve in this race, that becomes more manageable then. So it's not so much about, I can't believe I'm in the same race as that person, because if I'm focused on my race plan and what I need to do, then it's not like it doesn't matter what that person is there doing, but I've taken a step away from allowing that to control me. Especially, in a sport like this, everyone runs their own race. Clearly there's some interaction with the other people, as if you're running in a pack, that can be a challenge to navigate. But, at the end of the day, my race result comes down to the race that I ran, can have some influence from other people that were around me. If I'm in a strong pack and I'm able to stick with them, clearly that can influence my time. But at the end of the day, it comes back to, what am I doing? And so if we go back to that scenario and we really think it through, so maybe this is my first race in a group of people that I've kind of idolized or looked up to, and I can't believe I'm here. I don't feel like I belong. If I can reframe that and think about how cool this is that I have the opportunity to be in that group, use that as a little bit of additional adrenaline in my body, but then stay within the plan of my race plan, that can turn out pretty well. If I don't do that and I look at that as, I can't believe I'm in this group, and I let that if I let that adrenaline turn into a feeling of anxiety and worry, now it's going to be a lot harder for me to have a successful race, because I've taken what I look at maybe as like a neutral type of activation, if you think about this adrenaline in our body, I can take that down two roads. I can turn it into a positive and use that as energy for my race, or if it turns down the negative road, it can turn into anxieties and can really hamper my race. And so that would be one thing I'd look at there is, how do I perceive the situation, and can I get myself to believe that this is a positive and this is a really cool thing?
Wow. So with the athletes that you've dealt with in the past, I'm sure you've run into a few type A personalities, and even on my show, I've had people admit, yes, I'm type A. That's just who I am. Like, everything has to be perfect. They have to be in control. They have to dot their T's or dot their I's and cross their T's just right. And everything has to be laid out. But yet, whenever it comes to weather or some things that they can't control, it just gives them anxiety. Are there any recommendations that you'd like to give athletes to cope with not being in control and allowing that stress not to impact their mindset so much?
Yeah, sure. So it's, a classic phrase we hear a lot in sports psychology is control the controllables. So if I control the controllables, I have to stop and think about, what are the things that are honestly in my control? The weather is completely out of my control. If I'm staying in a hotel and my hotel is a crappy mattress, that's mostly out of my control. Maybe I have the opportunity to switch rooms or switch hotels, but those are things that are difficult to control. When I think about someone with a type A personality, they wants to be able to control everything. One thing I try to talk with those athletes about is the most important thing that you can try to control is your response to everything that happens. So I cannot control the weather. As much as I want to, there's no way I can control the weather, but I can control my response to the weather. And so if we know those athletes like to control something. And so let's say, instead of trying to control things that you have absolutely no power over, why don't we try to control the thing that you have 100% power over and control your response to those things? So if it's, if I show up to a race and the weather is terrible, every athlete in that race is experiencing terrible weather. Some people are going to control their response to that, and they're going to have a positive response. Some people are going to allow that weather to control them, and they're going to have a bad race. And so if we can reframe to get the people to think about, first to recognize what are things that I can control. I look back at myself as an athlete, especially early on. I was a total control freak. I wanted to control everything.
Really?
I was as a college athlete early on, especially, I was almost psychotic. I mean, I had to eat the exact same thing on competition day. I had to wear the same thing. So competing in this, triathletes would laugh at this, but competing as a thrower, clearly eating before and during a competition is going to have very little impact on me, because the sport I compete in takes about 3 seconds per attempt, as opposed to 8 hours or 16 hours. And so, I mean, I had, as a freshman in college, I had this routine where I would eat a lot. So in the round of throws before it was my turn to go throw, I would eat a sandwich. And then during my warm-up, in between attempts, I would eat a second sandwich. And then during my actual competition, in a track and field competition, in the throwing events, you have 3 throws in preliminaries, and then the top 9 people go to a final and take 3 more throws. Between every throw, I would eat a fig Newton. And so it was just this control over stupid stuff that didn't matter. And it was, if something went wrong, it was an anxiety in my head. That was almost 20 or about 15 years ago now. So 15 years later, I'm a little bit smarter now. And I don't compete in track and field anymore. I compete in, it's really a fringe strength sport called the Scottish Highland Games. But I travel around the U.S. and some internationally, compete as a professional. And in that, probably one of the most interesting things I've learned that has really helped me as a sports psychologist I've had some of the most horrible travel experiences turn into some of the best competitions of my life. I had one particular competition where I had booked a late flight to start with. My flight got delayed by like 3 hours. And so I ended up getting into my hotel room at 2 a.m. I got into my hotel room in Florida, and the air conditioning didn't work. And so it's like 80 degrees in our room. The air conditioning isn't working. And so we call the desk. Every other room in the hotel is full. So we're stuck in this room. And so room is hot. I'm tired. I have to get up in like 4 hours to compete. And oh yeah, by the way, I have a horrible head cold and I can't stop coughing. And so everything about that competition should have gone. I mean, everything leading up to that competition, just about that could go wrong, went wrong. And I came out the next day. I was tired in the morning, but I got going, and I ended up having literally one of the best competitions in my life in this sport. And so similar things like that happened a couple more times, where all the stuff that I used to really stress about trying to control and what really derailed me, all of it went wrong. And I went out there and did it anyway, and really had great competitions. And so kind of the lesson I learned from that is the stuff that happens, the stuff like that happens, that can impact your performance probably by about 5%. So you're maybe going to run 5% slower or something like that. I'm totally making these numbers up. Your response to those things is going to, if the actual events account for 5% of your performance, your response to those things can account for about 20% of your performance. So when somebody goes out and has a horrible race in bad weather or something like that, a lot of that is coming down to your response to that. So can I control the things that I can control? Most importantly, can I control my response to those things? So when those crazy events happen, like normally I would love to control all these things, but right now I can't for some reason. If I can learn to let it go and just go with the flow, especially something like weather, we know everyone in the race is dealing with the weather. If I can just let it go and just continue on my race, that's going to have a minimal impact on me. If I worry and stress about it, it is going to have a maximal impact on me.
Wow. So literally just letting it go and being comfortable with letting it go takes practice. And you had to learn it basically the hard way of, I can't control it. My plane was delayed. It's outside of control, bad everything. But then you came out on the other side better than what you expected. And that gave you the confidence to let it go.
Yeah, 100%. And honestly, competing in track and field, I would have never gotten there because I took it so seriously. Competing now in this sport, the Highland Games, it's ironic because in track and field, I trained for several years and never made $1 because prize money, especially in the throwing events, almost is non-existent. Competing now in this sport, I actually make some money, but it's a lot more laid back environment. And so it was just, I just kind of said, all right, whatever, let's see what happens. And I expected just to go out and have an average day, but I had just kind of a carefree attitude about it. And I went out there and I had a phenomenal day. And so again, like I said, it took me about 15 years of competing to ever figure that out. But my goal now in sharing those experiences is to help other athletes figure it out in slightly less than 15 years. And And it's honestly what got me over it. And when I travel to compete now, stuff happens and I just don't care because I've recognized now that even when things go really poorly, my body can still perform at near maximal levels and it's fine. So it really just hit home for me that what was killing me before when I would have a bad experience, when I'd have a bad competition after having some crazy experience like that, things I couldn't control. It was because of my response. It wasn't because of the things that happened. It was because of how I responded. Once I finally learned how to respond in a more proactive way and just deal with it, it turned out to not actually be that big of a deal.
Wow. So with all of this, it really comes back to an overwhelming sense of gratitude. And there's a coach in the triathlon world named Siri Lindley, and she actually has it tattooed on her wrist. And do you feel like having gratitude towards sport is really key in unlocking higher levels of performance?
Yeah, I do. I think, if you think about, we can think about gratitude in terms of a lot of things. The one thing that sticks out in my mind when you say that is gratitude for the ability to compete. I love to compete, and that's why I'm still competing in sport now. Is I love to compete, and for me, it's almost a little bit of it's a lab for me to learn more about sports psychology because I'm still in pursuit of the perfect athletic competition. As a sports psychologist, I recognize that perfection is a myth. There's no such thing as a perfect competition, but the pursuit of perfection, it doesn't mean you shouldn't pursue perfection. And so when I'm going out and competing, I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to go out and compete still. It's one of the most fun things that I do. It's a release from the rest of my life. And it's not like I don't like the rest of my life. I'm really happy, but to go out and do something that's just about me and experience the raw emotions of competition, sometimes the letdowns of competition, and then working through those and experiencing the positives of how great it feels when it does go well. It's almost an addiction. Honestly, I love going through that process. But so I think especially in a sport like triathlon, though, if we come back to that, you're putting yourselves through an incredibly taxing competition. It's not like you're going out and running a 5K race and going and having beers afterward. You're going through a really grueling competition, and you've trained an incredible number of hours for it. And so I don't think you can do that without gratitude, without an appreciation and a love for the sport. If it's too much to commit to only be sort of into it. And so if you're in that boat where you're not feeling grateful, or if you're not enjoying what you're doing, it's one of those things where sometimes you need to rethink, is this really for me? Is this what I want to be doing? Because I'd hate for somebody to spend 25 hours of their week training for a sport and not actually be that into it, because it's too much of a commitment, and you're taking away too much of your time for other things to not really be grateful and enjoy what you're doing.
Right. That's one of the things I love asking usually right after the finish line for most of the athletes that I interview. I ask this question: what did you get to do next? And it rephrases the mantra or the stimulus of the question versus, well, what did you do next? It's what did you get to do next? And just by placing that one word there, it's like, yeah, I got to do X, Y, and Z afterwards. I got to go and see my family afterwards. I got to do this and all this, because not everybody gets to the finish line. And that's what I really want to try to open up there is,
sure,
not everybody that I've had on the show got to the finish line. And it's something that I try to increase their gratitude by just acknowledging the fact that not everybody's there. With that, do you feel like there's a way to let go of stress fully before events and have gratitude?
I don't know that you can ever let go of stress fully before an event. I mean, your body is going to have a stress response, but I think how you manage that becomes really important. And so, if you're going into that event, and you need to have a little bit of both, probably. So the stress is going to be there. You've been planning for this, you've been preparing for this for several months, and it's going to be very challenging. You're very excited for it. A stress response is natural, and we don't really want that to go away, because your body produces a positive response to stress, provided that you can manage it and control it. But by pairing that with some gratitude, by pairing that with the excitements and the love for the sport, and I mean, gratitude really is the right term, being grateful for the ability to be out there to do this. The two are going to go hand in hand a lot better, because you're going to have the stress response within your body, but then you're going to have this overwhelming positive response of, I'm so glad that I get to do this. I'm so glad I am able to compete in this. I think to my last year training in track and field, leading up to the 2012 Olympic trials, I told my wife often, I really want to focus. I think this is going to be my last year doing this. I really want to focus on enjoying every one of my competitions. Because prior to that, I think this, I don't know what it's like in triathlon, but in track and field, it's very common that nine out of 10 people after a competition are disappointed because they didn't achieve the goal that they wanted to achieve, personal best or a placing. And so even if they're sort of happy about it, it's not a lot of people leave feeling really, really psyched about it. And so I didn't want to go through that many negative experiences. And so that small change in perception of, when I arrived to a competition, every competition I arrived to, taking a few moments and being so thankful that I had the opportunity to do this, and thinking about, how can I make this fun? How can I make this enjoyable? It really had a big difference in my outlook. And I felt, honestly, somewhat, at least, to my performance too.
Wow. So that almost like that reminds me of how many professional triathletes go in and at the start line, usually whenever there's a ton of tension, right before the cannon goes off. I mean, I was just on Instagram this morning. I was looking at Cody Bills' Instagram, and he has a picture with Lionel Sanders, and they're literally cracking jokes right before a full Ironman where Cody would go on to win and beat Lionel, which is his friend. But they're sitting there cracking jokes, the tension's light, and they're just enjoying the nature of the race versus going in there solely focused, close their eyes, get their music on, get focused and all that. They're trying to arouse themselves a different way and just let it go and approach it with gratitude.
Yeah, I think it's, every athlete approaches those kinds of things a little bit differently. If you observe professionals in any sport, there's a wide variety of how people prepare for their start of their competition. And so when we're looking at how people prepare, when you see something like that, those two guys that are clearly very successful joking around before the race, what's really cool about that, what's good about it is if you're laughing and you're joking, it's really hard to be tight and anxious when you're laughing and joking. And so if that is a means for you that can take you out of that and put you in a more kind of free, I call it a free headspace, I guess, where it's not necessarily, it's probably more positive as well, but you could be very focused and still be positive. But if you're a little bit more free, casual, looking like you're having fun, it makes it really hard for anxiety to get you. Other people want to be very deliberate and focused, and they have their routine that they go through, and they almost kind of stay completely within their own head. And there are athletes that are incredibly successful doing that. I don't think that's wrong. But either way, whichever one of those approaches you take, or it may be a different approach altogether, I think you just need to be in a space where you can effectively manage and avoid the pitfalls of negative thoughts that are coming at you. So if you're laughing and joking, it's really hard to get wrapped up in negative thoughts. But you could be very still, calm, and focused with headphones in, and you could still be using that as a means to keep negative thoughts away. So what I'd say, it's one of those things that kind of whatever works for you is what you should do. If it would be really unnatural for you to stand up there and try to joke around with people, that maybe is not for you. But if that is the type of person you are, and maybe you can look at what kind of a person are you outside of sport. Are you a person that is constantly kind of cracking jokes and stuff? Then you probably shouldn't try to be a different person in competition just because I'm supposed to quote unquote look focused and ready. It's you got to bring your own personality into that and allow that to express and get you to the place where you want to be prior to the start of your race.
All right. Now, I know there's a few different theories on how to get to the best optimal performance level, which is known as flow, or, I think Matt Fitzgerald has his own idea on this, but flow is basically the perfect day for everybody. So how would you really help athletes get there in a race like this?
Well, the thing about flow is we can't really make it happen. It's something that happens. It's something that happens pretty rarely. There's not a recipe to walk into every race and be in a flow state. So like you said, a flow state is, the way I would describe a flow state is everything feels incredibly easy. It's just happening just like it should. In a sport like this, you're feeling just really effortless, rolling through faster times than you've ever gone before. And everything is just perfect. And it's an incredible feeling. It's one of the coolest things I've ever experienced, but it's not something we can just make happen on demand. So the things we can do though, are we can control, we can look at having an effective level of arousal or kind of energy management. And so what we look at with that is, clearly in a long endurance event like a triathlon or like an Ironman specifically, we can't be crazy high energy for 8 hours or for all the way up to, if it's 16 hours or whatever the time is. You just can't be high energy forever. And so you need to figure out in an endurance sport, as I'm preparing for my race, where do I need my energy to be? It's probably somewhere kind of a mid-level. And so I'm not completely psyched out of my mind, but I'm not utterly calm either. Some athletes early on, they think they need to be incredibly calm to be able to perform well. It's not, you don't want to be like you just got out of a yoga session or a relaxation session. You want to be where you need to be able to race well. And so for most people, that's kind of somewhere around a kind of a moderate level of energy, moderate level of arousal. And then from there, you need to figure out, if I show up on a race day and I'm too excited, I'm too aroused, or I'm too mellow, I'm too flat, how do I get myself to the right place? And so we look at some basic techniques, a lot of times different variations on breathing techniques to either increase or decrease our level of energy till we get to where we feel we're at a good place. So controlling arousal would be one piece that could create the opportunity to have a flow experience. It doesn't mean it's going to give you a flow experience, but you're trying to set the scheme. And so for a flow experience to happen, probably a large number of things need to kind of fall into place. And then you're going to have that kind of ultimate flow experience. But you don't need to have a flow experience to go out and have a great race. You need to get yourself to a pretty good place and allow the race to happen then. So controlling your arousal level, directing your thoughts effectively, having a strong plan, having good fitness coming in. If I put enough of those things together, I can get close to a flow state. And then every now and then, for whatever reason, we're going to get into a race and it's just going to feel great that day. And then we're going to have that kind of magical flow experience that people talk about.
Man, and I've only had it happen like twice in all the races I've raced. And it's magical and it's something worth chasing. And I feel like coupling gratitude with the mindfulness techniques, it helps eliminate the stress, brings in gratitude and just hey, you know that you're able to do this versus you have to do this. And it really piques you just the right way. Is that like a recipe that you try to incorporate with everybody?
I think generally those are some good components of it. So when we think about, mindfulness over the last about 5 years has become a really common term in sports psychology. And so with mindfulness, what we're really talking about is staying in the moment without judgment. So being in the moment. So again, when I'm in the moment, I'm not worried about what is going to happen in the future. I'm not worried about something that has happened in the past. I'm right here present in the moment. And whatever's going on, I'm just kind of living it. So it's not, from a mindfulness standpoint, we're not necessarily saying I'm never going to have negative thoughts. We're saying when a negative thought comes into my head, I'm going to acknowledge it quickly and then I'm going to let it pass through because I'm moving on to the next moment. So I'm always staying in the present moment. When we, with the negative thought thing, if I latch onto a negative thought and I hold on to that, now I'm pulling myself away from the present, and I'm either, negative thought might relate to, I didn't prepare well enough for this. I don't think I'm in good enough shape. I don't think I'm going to be able to finish this race. So that's pulled me back to the past. I'm out of the present. Or it might be worrying about how is this going to turn out, or what's that person going to run? And now I'm worried about the future. So if I stay in the moment and I have kind of the gratitude that you've been talking about, so a general pleasant enjoyment of the moment, that puts me in a really good place to be able to experience flow. And there is some research out there that shows when people practice techniques of mindfulness over time, that they're more likely than other people to experience flow more often. And so I would say that's a major piece of the puzzle of getting to that flow experience. But I would say the most important thing that you have to recognize is you can't try to create it. So if I go into a race and say, I'm going to try to do all this stuff so I can have a flow experience, if you try to make it happen, it's probably not going to happen. It sounds starting to sound kind of mystical and kooky, but it's like you said, you've experienced it maybe 2 times in your life. And I've competed in throwing sports for almost 20 years now. And I could probably count on one hand the time I've experienced a true flow state. And it's not always going to happen, and you don't want to try to make it happen. But what you do want to do is you want to try to put yourself in a good mindful space where it can happen if it's ready to.
Wow. So does that mean athletes should keep logs of what they do then? I know you mentioned you kept logs and you kept a training plan when you were self-coached, but would this be a good thing to reflect on in the future and stay mindful?
Yeah, I think reflection is very good with training. So what I would say when you're looking at reflecting on training is maybe you want to think about what is it that I'm reflecting on. So, I've talked to a lot of people in a variety of sports, especially I'm thinking of a few really well-respected coaches in the track and field community that they swear by athletes keeping a training log. They require every one of their athletes to keep a training log. And I've done that off and on in the past. Sometimes I've been very disciplined with after every training session, I'm writing down what I did. I'm writing down how my body felt, what came out of that. And sometimes I've kind of gotten away from that. And so I think it is any type of reflection. I mean, even outside of sport, we know reflecting on your experience tends to help you to improve in the future. And so it might come down to what are you writing in these journals? So if you're keeping a training journal, what do you want to write about? And so maybe it's some basic prompts about how did you feel today? How are there things, how did you sleep? How are relationships going? So where I find training logs most successful, both as an athlete and as a coach, probably not so much as a sports psychologist. I'm not usually looking at people's training logs, but I find it helpful to kind of go back and piece through and understand why things are happening. So from a physiology standpoint, as a coach, a lot of times you're planning out training blocks and you're thinking this is how an athlete should progress through training. And I would say if we get through this, I imagine this is the end result that this person can get to. And so we get that all on paper and it looks wonderful. And then we get into it and we realize we're dealing with humans, not robots. And it doesn't always work that way. So sometimes if you have some good reflective training logs that can help you to understand maybe where things have gone off track or what other factors are influencing the results that we're seeing. But it's not something that should ever be controlling. I think athlete to athlete, it can vary a little bit. I can recall one athlete that I've worked with that, for him, he was kind of a high anxiety person in training, get frustrated a lot, feeling negative thoughts a lot. And for him, writing in his training log after a training session was almost therapeutic to him. He's really? Like he needed to be able to process that. He needed to be able to get that out on paper. And that helped him to then walk away from training without that constantly being on his mind. So it was almost like just kind of a free writing dumping of frustrations, emotions, and being able to move on with more of a positive mindset the next time he came back. So that I don't think every athlete is like that, but for certain athletes, especially, if an athlete already likes to do some type of journaling or reflection outside of training, doing something like that might work well for them. If someone doesn't really like doing that, we don't want it to be an extra chore that they have to do. We don't want it to be something that they feel obligated to do. I would probably approach that as kind of an athlete to athlete decision on whether or not they feel like they are personally getting value out of it, or if they don't really feel like they need to do it.
Wow. So to kind of wrap up with a few extra questions here that we have left that I have. Is motivation something that you feel like is real, or is it more of an established habit that's formed over time?
Honestly, I would say the two probably have to go hand in hand, because if you aren't motivated to compete in this sport, you're not likely to be disciplined and continue to go through and form those habits. If you consistently perform these habits, if you are consistently doing these things, that probably has an influence on your motivation. So I think in terms of motivation, it's kind of a big, messy topic. If you look at research on motivation, it's all over the place, trying to understand different types of motivation, what do different people respond to. And so I'd say on a most basic level, a person has to have some type of motivation to go out and train in this sport. They're not person that's not motivated to compete in triathlon is not going to put in the training required to compete in triathlon. And so the motivation is there. What you then look at from there is, if you want to be successful, establishing consistent habits is probably one of the most important things that you can do. If we look across a variety of sports or disciplines, there are any number of ways to train. There is no ultimate training program. The number one predictor of how successful somebody is probably their consistency. So, I mean, there can be exceptions to that. You could have somebody that's following a really horrible training program, and even if they're consistent in following it, they're not going to do well. But if I have a good, solid, fundamental training program and I follow it consistently, most likely I'm going to get better. When athletes don't have the consistency of training, even if they're following the best training plan in the world, they're probably not going to get better because all the pieces aren't fitting together to build them to the better version of themselves that can achieve the goal they're trying to reach. So I think establishing habits is incredibly important to success. Being consistent in the way that you're training, in the way that you're sleeping, in the way that you are feeling your body, all of those things, if you're doing them consistently over time, are going to have a really positive influence. But I don't think any of those things happen if you're not motivated to do what you're doing.
Right. You know, I love asking the same question to so many athletes, pros, elites, winners. It's always the same thing, because I always ask, you know, in training, were there any days where you just mentally didn't want to train? And usually they respond with a laugh or something like that, because it's like, yes, there are those days. And it comes back to the motivation just really isn't there that day. But some athletes, they're like, okay, well, I got to do the work. And they push through it. And then that goes back to what you were saying earlier with the overreaching and kind of knowing where you are in the program. But everybody deals with it. How can people get past that?
Well, so what I would say is, on those days, they may not have the motivation to train on those days, but they definitely still have the motivation to reach their end goal. And so there are days where people are going to wake up and they're going to feel terrible, and that's the last thing they want to do is get out of bed at 5 a.m. and go train. But if their overall goal is so important to them, even if they hate the idea of training, they're going to go do it. And so I've worked with a ton of athletes like that. I worked with, at one time I was working with a number of swimmers, and I was working with some long distance swimmers, not this is, college swimming pool length stuff, but the training hours are still very long, getting in the pool at 5 a.m. and going back and forth in the pool forever. And so in something like that, there are days where you don't want to do that. But if you are so passionate about reaching your goal, qualifying for a certain event, or finishing an Ironman for the first time, whatever it is that drives you, the overall drive of that long-term goal can override any short-term discomfort of not wanting to go train, and you get out there and you just do it. And so I would say that's the most important thing is, does the person have that deep passion in their gut for whatever it is they're trying to achieve? Because if you have that, you can get over a lot of short-term discomfort and make yourself go train. But if you don't have that, then why would you go do it? If you're just sort of doing triathlon because you signed up for this, or you used to be really into it, but now you've got a family and you don't feel as excited about triathlon anymore, those day-to-day habits are going to be really hard to get out, and it's going to be hard to make yourself go train when you don't feel good if you don't have an overarching passion that's driving you.
So it's almost like when Forrest Gump decided to stop running.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I'm envisioning is, well, I just want to go home.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if you look at traumatic experiences of, people are, if you think about, I remember reading a story one time, this is several years ago, and this is a random thing. This guy in, I think, northern Wisconsin was out ice fishing with his 2 young kids, and they fell through the ice. And it was like 0 degrees outside. And so there's no way that they should have lived, but he got them out, and he walked like 2 miles in this freezing cold, completely soaked, to get to a house to get help for his family. And it's like, why why would I do, how can I possibly put one foot in front of the other? If I think about it on that micro scale, I mean, I'm hypothermic. How can I possibly put one more foot forward? And if you think about it on that scale, you probably say I can't. But then if it's on this larger scale of I need to do this to save the two most important people in my life, you're going to get it done. And so that's a much more large scale, dramatic example. But even if you think about within a race, if I'm in an Ironman and I'm so passionate and this is so important to me that I'm going to finish this, the discomfort that I experience during the race, my mind and my body are going to find a way to overcome because I want to achieve this goal so badly. But if I don't have that drive and passion, it's really, really hard to get yourself through the short-term discomfort.
Man, speaking of the cold, I interviewed this guy about this fire and ice race. It's a race that I'm never going to do by far. It is a no from me. And it's 250 kilometers over, I think, 5 or 6 days. You have to carry all your own gear.
Yeah. And
you do marathons back to back, at least at 2 days. And then you have river crossings that are glacial river crossings. And some people were taking their shoes off. Some of them weren't. And I'm sitting here going, no. And then the fact that it's nearly 30 degrees with winds of over 60 miles an hour. That's a no.
Wow.
Like, the mental toughness that Tom had to do that race is just ungodly in my mind. How can I get on that level of being able to deal with so much crap?
It's got to come down to, it has to be important to you. And so if for whatever reason in your mind, completing that fire and ice race is like the holy grail of endurance sports, and that you just have some drive in your gut that you want to do that, you probably can find a way to get yourself through that. But if you don't have that passion to complete that race, you shouldn't lie to yourself and pretend that you do, because you're probably going to set yourself up for failure. And so in that respect, I think that's something that can change over time. But if you don't have the passion to do something like that, it's probably not something you're going to pursue. But you might pursue something else, that maybe it's this other certain race that you've always watched and you thought that seemed like just the coolest race. And even if it's really grueling, if that's really exciting to you, you might find a way to do that. Maybe it's in the same time, maybe it's 5 years down the road, you've done all these other things and you feel like there's nothing left to achieve in these other races because you've met the goals you want to meet. And then you look up this fire and ice race again and you say, I wonder if I could do that. And it starts to build in your head and you start to think about it some more. And then you start to do some small training sessions. You start to do some cold runs and you do a shorter cold run, or maybe you just do a cold marathon somewhere. And then you start to say, well, if I could do that, then maybe I could do that. And so it becomes, again, kind of circling back to self-efficacy. If I think I can do that, if I think it's realistic or possible in my mind, then maybe I can allow myself to want to do it. And if it becomes something that's passionate in my mind that I really would love to do that, then I find a way to train for it. It's the same thing with really any of the, I'm in awe of all endurance athletes because I don't do anything endurance related. It seems awful to me, but my one experience I've had in a true endurance race was in high school. Out of nowhere, I competed in a 23 kilometer cross country ski race. And aside from that, I've never done any type of endurance thing. And so you need to have a passion to want to finish it. If you don't have a passion to want to do something, then you probably shouldn't try to do it, I guess. You need to figure out, I'd say the more important thing is then figure out what are you passionate about doing and put yourself through the training and grueling challenges to be able to reach that goal.
Man. So if my goal overall is to get more mentally tough, how can I quantify this, measure it, and actually put it on paper and know I'm getting better? Is there a way to do that?
That's kind of a tough thing to answer because when we look at the term mental toughness, it's such a broad term, and it's almost kind of undefined. It's one of those things you look at people and say that athlete's mentally tough, and so I think people have tried to quantify the term, come up with different like mental toughness scales where you're taking these survey answers, and so something like that you could probably somewhat quantify it. What I would say more so is that's probably, if you come back to coaching, people often talk about the idea of coaching is both a science and an art. I think that falls a little bit closer to the art side of understanding, am I observing changes in this athlete that I think is making them more mentally tough? Now, if an athlete wants to improve their mental toughness, what I would probably honestly start with on an individual basis is figuring out, what about your mental game right now do you think needs work? Is it that you really feel like, if you really feel crippled by negative self-talk, we need to build a plan to try to counteract that negative self-talk, redirect to something else, allow it to pass through our mind and move on. If I feel like on race day I show up and I am so nervous that my stomach is in knots, I'm vomiting before the race, my heart rate is through the roof, and then I get into the race and I can never finish the race. If it's something like that, we need to work on anxiety management. And so I would say that would probably be the way I would challenge that, is figure out, what about your current mental toughness do you think needs work? And then we would develop a plan for how can we move forward and try to improve that. So
is there like a list of different traits that would be defined by different areas to work on?
If I had to think of a few things I don't think there's really a defined list, at least that I'm not aware of. The things I would think of off the top of my head are, how do you manage anxiety? How do you manage motivation? If there's a struggle with motivation and training, we need to dig in and figure out what's the root of that and why is that there? So if we look at anxiety, motivation, if we look at, managing thoughts, managing emotions during a competition, that would be one thing to pay attention to. If I really struggle with getting wrapped up in the competition element, where I get so worried about competing with others, that kind of falls under the anxiety umbrella, but that would be a more specific example that we would work on. So I would say, that's probably a good start of a list. The thing I would really focus on, I think, is to try to ask the athlete to reflect a lot on their experiences that they've had and identify any shortcomings that they can see. So generally, if an athlete is concerned with mental toughness, it's probably because when they're competing, they feel like there's something they're not doing well. And if we can start there and kind of figure out with each athlete what's going on, then we can develop a plan for how to handle this and move forward.
Okay. So how can athletes really distinguish between mental fatigue and physical fatigue? Because even in all the training, there's fatigue of what the job gives you, what your family gives you, your kids give you, the stress of doing laundry. I mean, there's only so many choices a person can make through the day. And that's why if you do workouts in the morning, most of the time they're better. But how can you distinguish between mental and physical fatigue?
I guess the easiest way to distinguish in my mind would be to identify, is there just one or both there? So when I'm physical fatigue, clearly, so if you feel mentally really good, if you feel mentally strong, if you feel alert, you feel ready to go and you're going out and you're just not able to reach whatever benchmarks you think you should be able to, then that sounds very physical. I would say most often the two probably aren't going to be that separated. If I'm experiencing mental fatigue, if I'm experiencing physical fatigue, a lot of times I also have mental fatigue. But I would say in triathlon, a lot of people that are training for triathlon are also working, also have families. And so there are a lot of things outside of sport that can be mentally fatiguing. I've worked with athletes that are teachers actually, and during the school year, their training isn't necessarily going badly, but their performance kind of hangs around a certain level. And then about 2 weeks into their summer break, suddenly their performance just skyrockets, and it's because the mental fatigue of teaching is gone. So, in thinking about how can I manage those things as an athlete, I need to be a little bit mindful about, first, what do I have going on in my life, and recognizing sometimes that the mental fatigue of what I do outside of my training is going to influence my training 100%. I can't pretend it's not. Even if I just have a desk job where I'm not physically active at work, the mental fatigue of doing the work that I'm doing is going to have an influence on my training. And so to some extent, I can try to do what I can to manage that, to try to keep myself from being overly taxed. And then the other thing I would recommend with managing that is just thinking about how much can I control that. When I was competing my last Olympic trials, I was a PhD student while I was competing, and one thing I was very intentional about is occurs in June every year, or not every year, every 4 years for track and field. And so what I did the year leading up to that is I took a really heavy course load my fall semester, so that then I could take a really light course load my spring semester, knowing that I wanted to have less mental fatigue as I got closer to my main competition season. And so in the workplace, are there things that you can do if your big race is coming up in a month? Are there things that I can manage in my work life, in my family life, where I can try to reduce or minimize the mental fatigue so that I know that's not holding back my performance in my actual training for my sport?
Okay. With recovering the mental fatigue, is there a way that you could use like meditation or mindfulness techniques or yoga to kind of release some of that mental fatigue?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the most important thing you think about, so imagine you have a really stressful job. When you leave work at the end of the day, how successful can you be at leaving those work thoughts at work? And so if I look at using some type of a meditation technique after work at the end of the day, or if I have some other type of technique where I'm able to really, really disengage from work and re-engage with the other areas of my life, if I can successfully do that, if I can turn my mind off of all those things when I leave the office, that's going to put me a lot farther ahead than if I'm continuing to think about those on the drive home and while I'm eating dinner and before I go to bed at night, especially before you go to bed at night. If you can go to bed with a clear mind, your sleep is going to be so much better that's probably going to resolve some of that. If I'm constantly stressed about really anything, I mean, it could be work related. It could come back to stress about your competition. If I'm worried about how I'm doing leading up to the competition, if I'm constantly thinking about that, that's mentally fatiguing, and that's going to hurt me. And so I think especially before bed, I would think about something like that. If someone is in a high mental stress time, using some type of a management technique like meditation, breathing technique, something where I'm getting my mind off, freeing my mind and allowing my mind to actually truly rest when I do go to sleep, that's probably going to have a pretty big impact on how that fatigue carries through.
Okay, so along the lines of sleep, do you feel like sleep is an emotional or physical need?
All of the above, probably. Clearly we know there's tons of sleep research that tells us how important it is for, especially for, peak performance training, but really just our health in general. And so I would have to say it's both. I mean, clearly from a physical standpoint, your body needs sleep to recover. We look at improvements from training. You improve when you allow yourself to recover. It's not from the training that you do. It's from recovering from that and allowing your body to grow. And so I'd say from a physical standpoint, if you're not sleeping well enough, you're going to have some problems. But mentally and emotionally, if you're sleeping 4 hours a night and you're trying to work full time and you're trying to train 20 hours a week for triathlon, you're going to have a really hard time coping mentally and emotionally. Your mind needs that time to rest too.
Yeah. So to wrap things up, I only have two more questions here, and that's, so after a big event, like say after your last Olympic trials here, or an Ironman, oftentimes athletes feel upset or sometimes even depressed after it's over. How can folks get over this depression and manage this the right way?
Yeah, that's a very, very real thing that happens to a lot of athletes. I mean, think about it, if you're training for something for an entire year or sometimes maybe for 4 years, there's a lot of emotion that comes from the fact that is over, whether it went good or bad. Even if it went really well, you had the best competition of your life. It's a loss. And so if you think about treating it like a sense of loss, like you've lost something or someone, you're going to have a time point of grief. So probably the most important thing about that is to recognize that does happen, that will happen, and that's natural to happen. And then really kind of treat it the way you would treat any type of grief. So you're kind of working yourself through the stages of grief and allowing yourself to experience those emotions. And if this is something that continues on for a long time, that's probably when you want to seek out a counselor, a mental health professional, just to talk through and figure out what's kind of keeping you on that. But I think from an acute standpoint, I think, when I was competing as a track and field athlete, especially once I was married, my wife would talk about this. I actually didn't recognize it for a long time, but my wife eventually told me, like, every year at the end of the track season, you have like a 2-week depression. And once she said that, I reflected on it, and it was so true. And it's if you think about the number of hours that you're training for that for such a long time, and everything is about training for that event, looking forward to that event. Once it happens, you've almost kind of had a major adjustment in your life where you're not training for that thing anymore. That thing is over. And so you almost lose a little bit of your identity. It's like, well, what do I do with myself now? And so the things I'd recommend, I guess, are just to work through and manage those emotions that do come, understand that that's natural and is going to happen. And then, one other thing that can help is use that time maybe to start to re-engage with other areas of your life that you've kind of stepped away from a little bit, whether that be engaging and spending more time with family, enjoying kind of a special event with your family, or re-engaging in another hobby that you like that you maybe don't have time for. Timing wise, this wouldn't have worked for me, but once I started training year round for track and field, I gave up snow skiing. I really liked doing snow skiing before that, but I couldn't ski in the middle of my track season, so I stopped skiing. And so clearly in the summer, I couldn't go out and go snow skiing. But if there's something else that you really enjoy doing that your sport has kind of kept you from doing because of the training schedule, if you re-engage with those other things in your life, it can help you to kind of pull up those other areas of your identity so that the loss of your sport area doesn't seem so overwhelming.
Wow. So as far as to wrap up everything here, what's a tip that you would want to give every athlete listening to kind of take away from this to help better improve their mental health in general?
If you think as far as mental health, I'd say the most important thing, and this really extends beyond athletes too, is step one is be aware of the fact that there are times in your life where you're probably going to deal with some type of mental health thing, and be aware of the resources that you have in your life to be able to handle that. So when we look at mental health services, counseling, seeing a psychologist, it's gotten a lot better, I think, in the U.S. anyway, but there's still kind of a stigma attached to that where some people are hesitant to want to seek out mental health care. And it's, depending on what's going on, it can be a really positive experience. Even if you are going through something where you're not sure, it's like, I don't think this is really that big of a deal. But if it's consistently really bothering you, really getting an appointment with a licensed professional counselor, even if that may seem intimidating to you, to be able to freely talk about it with somebody who is trained to listen effectively, it can make you feel so much better. So I'd say that'd be the number one advice I would give is to not be afraid to engage and try that. It doesn't mean that you're weak as an athlete or weak as a person. It's, if you want to frame it in this way, it's one more piece of the puzzle of how can I make myself a better person and a better athlete. So even if sometimes it may be just a really short-term thing, but if you get a few sessions in with a good counselor and are able to get some things off your mind and be able to process them in your own mind, that alone can have a really positive effect instead of allowing it to kind of continue to stir and build in your mind and end up causing problems down the road. Wow.
Well, Dr. Becker, I really appreciate your time today, and I've enjoyed this experience of talking with you about all the things that revolve around triathlon and endurance sports and all the mental health and toughness stuff. It's been great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. It was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, have a good day, and we'll talk soon, okay?
Yep, bye.
Thanks for tuning in today. I hope you were able to learn something from today's episode. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to leave a review on iTunes or share it with a friend. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you'd like to see pictures from this athlete's race,
Learn more about who I am, what I'm doing, or be on the show yourself to share your story, check out my website at CoachTerryWilson.com. Until next time, continue the pursuit.